Adrian, you ready? Yeah? Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jennifer Rogers. I run the CAPI Center. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I also want to welcome, we have a live stream audience today, so welcome to everyone watching remotely. Because we have the live stream audience, I just want to let you all know that, just so you're aware, so when you ask questions later, and also if when you do ask questions, you hit the button to speak with the microphone on, that'll help our remote audience here as well. I also wanted to let you all know that we have one more program after this one for the semester. It will be Tuesday evening here at Columbia from 6:30 to 8:15. 2 free New York CLE credits will be offered, and it's about the upcoming vote on whether or not to hold a New York State Constitutional Convention. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but every 20 years it's on the ballot whether we should hold a constitutional convention. This year there's been a particularly vigorous debate about that, in large part because, at least as far as what we do at CAPI, ethics reform and anti-corruption work, we've been really unable legislatively to get some of the reforms that many people think we need passed through the legislature. So many are saying if we have a constitutional convention, that's one way to get some reform up in Albany. So the vote is in November, and on Tuesday we'll be discussing that upcoming vote and some research work that CAPI has done in conjunction with our partners at Wagner College about, it's a survey of all 50 state constitutions and the ethics reform provisions that are in those state constitutions with an eye towards thinking about if there is a constitutional convention, what reform measures might be the right ones to try to put into the Constitution. So we'll be discussing that work on Tuesday evening. If you're able to join us for that, please sign up on our website. Okay, and if you're here for CLE, please make sure you've signed in and that you sign out afterwards. So what we'll do is we have kind of 2 mini panels. We'll have these 3 gentlemen speak first, and then we'll take a short break and proceed with our second mini panel of 2. As you all know, procurement fraud is a huge problem, and there are huge, huge numbers involved. I'm sure it's the one single kind of biggest ticket item as far as corruption and government money going to waste. But on the other hand, if you go too far with procurement fraud prevention measures, then you risk damaging the efficiency of the process for vendors. You risk, moving prices too low and increasing fraud. So there are all sorts of issues there and tensions there that we will be exploring in the next hour and a half or so. So this first mini panel will last about 65 minutes. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions. I'll have those little annoying signs to let you know when there's 5 minutes left in your 15 minutes, just so you're aware of the timing. And then we'll have about 40 minutes for our second conversation. So let me introduce our panelists. First, to my far right is John Traylor. John is the Executive Deputy Controller at the Office of the New York State Controller. He oversees the Operations Division, which includes basically everything, but also including state contracts. Before this position, which he's held for 4 years, he was the Chief Procurement Officer for the State Office of General Services. John is a Columbia grad, having obtained a Master's of Public Administration and Public Finance here, so welcome back. Joel Turkowitz, to my left, is a lead public sector specialist in the Public Integrity and Openness Directorate in the Governance Global Practice at the World Bank Group. That's even a longer title than CAPI when you spell it out, so that's impressive stuff. Joel works extensively on anti-corruption matters, including procurement reform, and he's done so in many different areas, including in Asia, Thailand, and India. And Joel is a Columbia Law School grad, so welcome back to you as well. Adam Graycard, to my immediate right, is Australian, so he did not go to Columbia. Boo, boo, Adam. I didn't go to Columbia either. It's okay. Adam is a professor at the School of Social and Policy Studies at Flinders University in Australia. He also was a professor at Australian National University and spent many years working in Australian government. Adam has taught and written extensively on corruption and brings his practitioner eye to trying to find practical ways to categorize and ultimately prevent corruption. Adam is currently studying procurement, and he's going to share with us some of his thoughts on that topic and his kind of categorization techniques for procurement fraud. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to John. And here's the little clicker here. Yeah, and you can see the presentation.
Thank you.
There. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, good morning, everybody. Nice to be back up in Morningside Heights. Been a few years since I've been here. So my brief remarks today are really from a practitioner's perspective. I always like to start with what the heck is the Office of the State Controller. It's one of the best kept secrets in state government. So for those of you who may not be aware, the Controller is one of 4 separately elected statewide officials in this state, along with the Governor, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Attorney General, and he's the state's Chief Fiscal Officer. So what does that mean? Well, our organization is usually 3 or 4 separate offices in most other states. So it's a unique and fairly powerful operation, right? So he's the state's Chief Fiscal Officer. We oversee the accounting system. We produce the financial statements for the state of New York. We pay 250,000 people every 2 weeks. We report on state finances, all of the kind of controllerly things that you think about. But he's also the state's chief auditor, not just for state agencies, but also for local governments, which is a rather unique role. He also is the sole trustee of a $200 billion pension fund, the New York State Common Retirement Fund. And we have treasury functions as well. So oftentimes those are all separate offices in most states. So we have a pretty broad financial oversight mandate for the state. So specific to procurement, we really have responsibilities for the entire procure-to-pay cycle, right? So we have a constitutional responsibility to audit all payments in the state and oversee the accounts of the state. We have statutory responsibility to review and approve most contracts in the state. So that creates somewhat of a unique role, what we call pre-audit role, because we're doing that before those things are officially contracts and payments of the state of New York. So unlike a lot of audit organizations, which are a pay and chase approach, those things get approved and then you audit them on the back end on what we call a post-audit basis. We're doing that before they have the effect and force of law. The challenge for us is New York State's a big entity, right? And you can see the numbers up on the screen, right? 21,000 contracts flowed through our organization, $54 billion. We processed 31 million payments last year. We have a vendor base of over 250,000 entities that we have to do business with. We try and do that quickly because our vendors like to get paid, or our agencies want to make sure that those contracts get in place. So we average about 10 days for contracts and 2 days for payments. How do we do that? We have to use a risk-based approach. We use a lot of audit techniques, algorithms, things like that to say where are our highest risks, which are the ones that we need to spend the most time on. And interestingly, our organization is really trying to move, and I think this is true of most audit organizations, what I like to call moving audit from a noun to a verb. The advent of IT data analytics is allowing us to look at large data sets much more quickly, try and identify where there might be risks, and focus on those risks so that we can do our job, but do it in a way that isn't slowing the process down too much. So, public procurement in particular has a lot of challenges to it, and we often have conflicting goals, right? The taxpayer wants us to save money, get the lowest price, best value, right? Our agencies say, get it done, get it done, get it done. I've got a mandate, I've got a new program I got to get up, a law just passed that says I've got to have this in place in 90 days. We have socioeconomic goals, so that's MWBE, preferred source, small business, a number of other folks that want to get state money as a way to grow their businesses. And then we have the statutory good government responsibilities to have fair, open, and competitive processes. Unfortunately, that tends to slow things down a little bit, right? So there's There's tension among all those goals. There's a lot of money at stake, as you saw by the last slide, right? And procurement does create winners and losers. Somebody gets those contracts and somebody doesn't. Obviously, the losers are never happy when they don't. In New York, we're fairly decentralized in the way in which we manage our contracts, so that we don't necessarily act as the state of New York, but as agency by agency. And we have a very complex legalistic environment. I think you'll hear from folks on the second panel today about how complicated it is to get a contract with New York State. In fact, one vendor said, you know, you need a lawyer and a lobbyist to figure this all out, right? That's tough on small businesses. That's tough on out-of-state businesses, not necessarily business-friendly. So all of those things combine, right? And you layer on top of that the fact that most of our agencies don't have good procurement metrics. They don't administer their contracts very well. We're working on, but don't yet have, a single technology platform to manage our procure-to-pay process. All of those factors together in what we're talking about today create opportunities, frankly, for fraud, waste, and abuse, right? They create lots of doors, lots of tensions, lots of complexity that can open the door or encourage people to use the contracting process for, and again, when I think of fraud, it's really fraud, waste, and abuse, right? Very little criminal fraud, unfortunately, ever gets prosecuted. A lot of it is fraud, waste, and abuse. So you may have seen a few headlines about the state of New York lately. Procurement, interestingly, is in the news, although Albany has a long and time-honored tradition of graft and corruption, dating back to Tammany Hall. But we've had some fairly high-profile cases that are being prosecuted by the Southern District of the Federal U.S. Attorney's Office. Those are typically where people were circumventing the procurement laws and are alleged to have received kickbacks, bribes, and certainly spent a lot of taxpayers' money in questionable fashions. My boss, Comptroller DiNapoli, put forth a procurement reform proposal in the legislature last year, and Jennifer mentioned we did not, unfortunately, get that passed through the legislature, but we've been pushing to try and address some of the more egregious gaps in terms of oversight of public procurement. But the governor's office and others push back on that proposal, again, by saying this is going to slow the process down. We have to meet our economic development, socioeconomic goals. There may be other ways to do that rather than increasing that central oversight that our office provides. And that's the debate that we would expect to go on in the upcoming legislative session. So can we fix these problems? Well, again, there's a lot of different remedies or options that you can pursue, right? We certainly would like to see expanded oversight, but by whom, right, is going to be the question. Should it be our office? Should it be in the agency? Should it be an inspector general? Lots of different ideas out there. How do you restrict pay to play? The Supreme Court decision has made this infinitely more difficult, but at its root, can you really legislate ethics, right? This has been the challenge for procurement for many, many years. We actually have a number of laws on the books that, if they were followed, probably would have prevented some of this stuff, but people find creative ways around it. We have a number of our good government groups saying we need a lot more transparency around the procurement process, a database of deals that matches up who's giving money to what politician with who's receiving what state contract. The question there is actually that information's out there, although you'd have to do a little work at this point to put those things together. But ultimately, you know, who cares about that, right? What impact would that have? Because again, people have the right to make political contributions. And so how do we make public procurement work better? I talked about those tensions because there are so many competing goals, and so the question is always, better for whom, right? Better for the taxpayer, better for the small business, better for the agency. All of those things are questions that folks are going to have to work through as we talk about additional reform in Albany. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Joel.
Thanks so much. Let me see if I can get to... Great, thanks. So thanks so much. It's also really great to be back at Columbia Law School. It's been a while. My talk will actually be quite different, as kind of makes sense. So I work for the World Bank, and I sort of lead the work that the World Bank does overall in thinking about how we interact on corruption, how we confront corruption, how we deal with it. Let me give sort of a thumbnail about what the World Bank actually does, and then talk a little bit about procurement and where we see corruption. In many ways, echoing some of the things that have been said, but also in the context of the countries we work in, how do you deal with situations where you don't actually have very coherent governments all the time? How do you deal with situations where you don't have functioning legal systems? How do you deal with countries and situations where you can't assume sort of the standards and the expectations we have of rule of law countries? So that's, in some ways, this is a public policy discussion of, in those situations, what do you actually do about corruption? And especially if you want to make sure that procurement continues to happen. So the quick history of the World Bank. We were created at the end of World War II. There were three institutions that were created at the end of World War II, right? The UN, which was supposed to deal with the political dimensions of international development. The IMF, which was supposed to deal with the financial dimensions of development, sort of deal with financial crises. And the World Bank, which was supposed to deal with supporting countries in developing and building up their economies, right? It was initially thought of as it was going to help countries rebuild after World War II. So we work exclusively with countries. We have our mission is ending extreme poverty by 2030. Extreme poverty defined as people who live on under $1.25 a day. And the second mission is to improve prosperity of the lowest 40%. So how do you have inclusive growth where it's not just that you have increased GDP, but you have actually growth that affects poor people? So the goal of the institution is to address poverty. To do that, we have agreements with governments about particular types of actions, particular things. We lend money. Some of that money is highly subsidized money that is given to us by the countries of the world, and some of that is market-based, basically market-based money with sort of very long payment terms. We lend, I think our lending volumes, and I tried to check this, I think our lending volume last year was about $40 billion. We are the largest single lender in development, although our numbers sort of pale in comparison to private sector money, we're the largest sort of public sector institution lending money in development. So it's not at all that the World Bank sort of, that what happens in development is determined by the World Bank, but the World Bank is a contributor to the development agenda. So, and most of the money that we lend actually gets spent through procurement. The World Bank doesn't implement any projects, right? So we will agree with a government about an infrastructure project, the building of a dam or the building of roads or the building of schools or the improvement of judicial systems or the improvement of financial systems. There's an agreement that is created with the government that stipulates how the money is going to be utilized and what rules are going to be followed in the utilization. At that point, we don't then implement the projects. It is the government's money, it's the government's responsibility to implement the project, and it's our responsibility, like any lender, to ensure that actually those rules are followed, right? To supervise actually how the money is utilized and to ensure that those rules that have been stipulated are followed. We have that responsibility both to the people that we're lending to, but also to our own institution. So most of the money that we lend gets spent through procurement, but it's not the bank doing the procuring. It's the entities themselves doing the procuring. And when you think about the countries that we're working with, so most of the countries that we work with are countries that have limited access to private sector markets. So this runs anything from Iraq to the Democratic Republic of Congo to Morocco to Brazil. And we actually lend significant amounts of money still to China as well. There's sort of a big discussion going on of whether we should continue to be lending money to China. But if you looked at overall the countries that have the highest level of risk in the world relating to governance or concerns about corruption, all of those would be our clients. So we're dealing with a situation, and the critical thing is also you can't avoid it. If our mission is actually trying to deal with world poverty, then you can't say, well, these environments are just too risky, we can't lend into them, because that actually doesn't in any way assist development. So the challenge is, how do you lend into an environment that you know already is risky in ways that the money is going to be utilized to help people, to help the poor, to do what it's intended to do. And oftentimes this comes down to procurement and what happens in procurement. We see sort of three types, and to thinking about corruption, which is a very broad term, it's probably useful to think about cutting it into three different ways, right? So one thing is bribery, where I want a contract and I bribe someone in a transactional basis to get that contract, okay? A second form is collusion, right? And collusion can happen when, let's say I'm building roads in a country. There are a limited number of firms who build roads in a country. Those firms get together. They agree on who's going to get what contract. And they ensure that in the bidding for a contract, the firm that has everyone agreed would get that contract gets the contract. And oftentimes in these collusive rings, what happens is you just share the market. I have 8 companies. I share the market among those 8 companies. Each one of us gets a contract. Everyone is happy. And sometimes this also happens with the assistance of government officials who are also trying to do this. And the critical thing here is you have to try and keep other people from coming into the market, right? Because if you're 8 people and you have 8 contracts, everything's good. If you're now 15 people and you have 8 contracts, things aren't so good because some people aren't getting a contract. So the critical thing on a collusive ring is how do we make sure that that ring stays relatively small? The third set of corruption is actually the hardest stuff, which is about capture, which is in a number of countries, there are markets where the entire market is structured so that only a few people can benefit from the market. So for example, in energy markets, often we see this, where if you're going to actually build a power plant, the subsidization for the actual money that you can, the amount you can charge for energy is too low to make a profit. The only way you make a profit is through the subsidy that's provided by the government. When the subsidy gets really large, it becomes something that politically is vulnerable. And the only people who can count that that subsidy is going to be maintained are politically connected firms. So the market doesn't run by, can I actually produce energy efficiently? The market actually runs on saying, can I make sure I capture the subsidy in a consistent fashion to get return on my investment? In that situation, you can't do anything about the procurement rules to get to new firms coming in, because it's not about actually competing for the contract. It's about actually who has the political authority and the political ability to make sure that they're going to be able to capture a continuing income stream over years and years because they're an acceptable firm. So we see all three of these types of forms, right? The first one, bribery, is something that, happens all around. Second, collusion also is a relatively frequent occurrence, but, in many of the countries we're dealing with, it's at a level that's higher than in most of the places. And the thing about state capture is something that we don't often have here. The sense that where the political and the economic elites are so closely aligned that really what you're dealing with is, you're not dealing with an independent market. You're not really dealing with a contract between two parties. You're really dealing with ways of structuring revenue flows among the same sort of very tightly connected group. Okay, so what's the response? And what is it that we try to do in these situations? Obviously, some of these are a little bit easier to deal with than others conceptually, right? So bribery, conceptually, it's relatively easy, right? You try and identify where are there red flags. If you, as in the last presentation, you look across all the contracts and you say, where are there indicators? What indicates that bribery has happened around this contract? Maybe it's that a contract there's been a long period of time between when a contractor is selected and when a contract is actually signed. Or maybe it's that there's a high variation in cost in this particular contract. You know, we bought paper at $5. All of a sudden there's a contract where we're buying paper at $15. Something seems a little strange. So you create a set of red flags that allow you to say, here's a set of contracts that appear to have certain higher levels of risk. Then you try and create some mechanisms to investigate those contracts, either within your procurement authority or within your law enforcement authority and response from law enforcement. And you might create a set of rules that limit the discretion of procurement officers, right? So you try and create very, very clear rules about how procurement officers actually have to act and decision-making so that you try and prevent bribery or excessive discretion or the space that sometimes is utilized to make decisions and to make money. Collusion, you know, is a more difficult thing, but you can also look at it in ways of trying to understand through analysis of bidding behavior. You can also analyze and understand where are there collusive rings. So if you do sort of detailed analysis of who bids with who, you can start understanding where there are networks of bidders. It's also pretty important in this situation to understand actually who are the firms you're dealing with. So I have firm X and I have firm Y. Sometimes firm X and firm Y are actually owned by the exact same person. So you're not actually seeing competition, you're just seeing some owner who has 2 or 3 firms, and that person is just giving the appearance of competition. So one of the questions is also, let's figure out who we're dealing with. Who is it in front of us? What is it? What is the entity resolution? So when is a firm actually a firm versus just a sub-element of firm? And who owns firms so we have a better sense of who's actually in the deal. State capture is a much harder thing to deal with, right? Because when you're dealing with state capture, that third dimension, when kind of the whole market's been captured, the issue is you don't really have the idea that, well, we'll just have an independent entity that will come in and investigate, right? Or that we'll have, you know, think back to the example that I gave of the energy sector. That's the only way to understand, and the only way to unravel that is to begin to actually think about what are the policy decisions that have been made that have structured that market. And often those policy decisions are very well defended because those policy decisions are actually about the stability of governments. So when you look at energy sectors, or when you look at actually how political parties are financed or things like that, then oftentimes as you go into higher and more sophisticated forms of corruption, you're not dealing with someone just being enriched. What you're actually dealing with is actually how political systems share money in order to get stability. So if you looked at the actual mechanics, and we've done a bunch of this work in places like Tunisia, in places like Tanzania, in places like the Congo, and even actually in places like Italy, in the clean hands approach, what you would see is actually these very, very deeply entrenched structures that really are about they're not about contracts, they're actually about the political accommodations and political settlements. So a very profound level of having to consider what is actually at stake in those markets and how to address them. So given those things, what are our kind of responses? And once again, remember, we don't actually have the ability to then say, well, we're just going to implement this contract. We don't really have the ability to say, well, we're going to do an investigation. All of our resources are quite limited in actually being able to address this. And the thing that we also understand is in trying to address it, it's critical for us to find some balance. I think this last discussion of balancing between oversight and control and efficiency is a fundamental balance. But for us, it's also, in many countries, if you give police and judges and law enforcement greater authority, you just have to worry about the abuse of that authority, right? There's no reason to believe that that authority is only going to be utilized actually to prosecute bad people. And in fact, we have lots of situations where judiciaries and legal systems, rather than being ways to address corruption, are actually places where corruption is very strong. You also, whenever in trying to think of how do you address this, what you understand is the more that you have oversight of decision making, oftentimes the less people are willing to make decisions, right? If I'm at risk anytime I make a decision about who gets a contract, then basically the way I often approach this is I don't make a decision. I just pull it up the ladder and say, I'm going to give this to my boss to make that decision. And ultimately what happens, because you're trying to depoliticize decision making, is the only people who make decisions are the people who are politically powerful enough to feel like they're not going to be prosecuted. So you end up in a situation of politicizing decision making rather than depoliticizing decision making. The third thing that happens oftentimes is, what's the simplest way of making a decision in procurement? You just go to the lowest cost, right? Whatever the lowest number is, even if that number doesn't get you best value, as a way of protecting yourself from being accused of corruption, you just pick the lowest number. And at that point, you've had a whole sort of process where instead of looking to figure out how do we get the best value, how does the state get the best value for what it's spending, you end up just picking the cheapest price, which often doesn't actually get you the best. But it's a way of making sure, as a bureaucrat, it's a completely rational approach. How do I make sure I don't get accused of corruption? Well, if I pick the lowest cost, no one's going to accuse me of corruption, because it's the lowest cost. So there's an objective reason why I picked it. So there's one issue around how do you make sure that your response to corruption isn't creating an anti-corruption bureaucracy. And that's an oftentimes thing when we think about corruption. How do you address corruption in the bureaucracy? You create an anti-corruption bureaucracy. That anti-corruption bureaucracy works no better than the normal bureaucracy, right? It just ends up having a larger bureaucracy with different sets of powers. So a lot of what we try and do is think about increased competition, right? So how do you address corruption? If you don't think you can address corruption directly, if you don't really think that you can do it through law enforcement means, the other mechanism that you think about is, fine, how do we just get more market, and how do we get more people in the market? How do we increase competition? And by increasing competition, reduce the ability to control markets. So oftentimes when the bank thinks about this, that's what we think about. What is it that actually would be needed to get more people to come into the market? Now, to do that, you have to understand why people don't currently come into the market, right? So what is it that prevents people right now from bidding on state contracts? Is it that the state is just a really bad party? They don't pay you on time. It takes a very long time to actually deal with things. Is it that people are scared? So in many countries that we work in, there is sort of a physical intimidation of people putting in bids, and there's a physical intimidation of people actually doing contracts. So if that's the case, how do you deal with that? Maybe it's that people actually don't trust that the system's going to be fair. So if people already think that contracts are already been assigned, then they're not going to bid because it's just a waste of their money. So in thinking through what you need to do in order to increase competition, it's not a simple question. It is a question of what markets are you in, what actually are the dynamics within those markets, and what would it take to either shift markets or create a deeper market. So that's then becomes a fundamental question, because we don't expect that purely a legal response to corruption is going to be adequate or, in fact, necessarily value-adding. So fine, as a last time, so what does we actually do? We do a couple of things. One thing is we, at this point, spend a significant amount of time trying to create and help countries develop e-procurement systems. Right? So electronic procurement systems that allow transactions to be processed both for contract opportunities, to be advertised, for bids to be submitted, and sometimes for evaluations to happen. This is especially powerful when you deal with something like goods, like simple goods, we're often, buying paper. When you look at a government buying paper, each purchase might be quite small. The actual market is pretty large. And if you can get the market for goods to work effectively and efficiently, where you're actually having lots of competition, you can end up saving lots of money, but you can also end up actually promoting much more competition for performance, not competition for corruption. So one of the things we try and do is think about and adopt e-procurement systems, and as a way of increasing the efficiency of systems and as a way of reducing sort of possibilities and entry points for corruption. But as I've spoken about, you can understand this will not deal with all forms of corruption. E-procurement systems don't help that much on collusion. They do a little bit because they increase sort of awareness of contract opportunities, so sometimes it brings new parties in. But if you have very strong collusion rings, e-procurement systems aren't necessarily going to deal with it. And if you have state capture, obviously in state capture situations, it's not going to deal with it very much. The second thing then we do is we work out with procurement systems on trying to change sort of the types of contracts that are developed and the markets that they work in. So it's an attempt to try and say, if a market is captured, is there another way of dealing with that market? If we have a smaller contract, will we have more participants? If we have a larger contract, will we have different participants? If we, instead of having a contract to build something, if we have a management contract and the management company hires companies to build, will that address market capture? So a second thing is to try and really understand what market dynamics and to try and select markets that are more competitive. A third thing we try to do is we do try and support audit agencies and the ability for audit agencies to identify problems through performance audits. And we increasingly work on public participation. So in countries where you have a decentralized setting and you want to know, did a road get built the way it was supposed to? Or even was a contract tendering done appropriately? Increasing the participation of citizens in specific ways can be quite effective. So we have a whole set of work on open contracting and open information. Now, fourth thing we do is we try and create platforms for sharing information. So the World Bank has a mechanism for debarring companies that have been found to have engaged in corrupt activities. Almost all countries have such mechanisms. All of the other development banks have such mechanisms. Right now, though, if I'm the World Bank, I don't know actually which companies Egypt has debarred. I may not be so clear that I want to take Egypt's list of debarred firms so seriously, but it might be useful for me to know that. And it might be useful for Egypt to know what firms I've debarred. So one of the things is just to try and say, can we just share information across entities more effectively as a way of increasing the ability to make use of those oversight resources? And the state capture issue is, as I say, is not a procurement issue, but is an issue what we try to do is both think about this internationally. So are there international levers that actually affect what happens domestically? And we can talk a little bit more about that. But also, are there markets that aren't directly related to the political accommodation? Because what you want to do in state capture is increase economic diversity. If you don't have everything controlled by certain groups, but you have economic diversity where you have some new market entrants who want to compete and want to have rules, then over time the idea is that you would then potentially have a way of having a different political accommodation. But in those situations, the idea that we're going to actually frontally address corruption, I think we're probably mistaken. I'm going to stop here and thanks, and on to Adam.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's a very great pleasure to be here today with you all, and in particular to follow two very distinguished practitioners, one of whom talked about corruption essentially in rich countries, and the other who talked about corruption in poor countries. And the first thing to note is that there is a significant difference between the way corruption plays out in both rich and poor countries. And what I'm going to do today is talk about some research in rich countries. I'm going to try and develop a framework for understanding corruption in procurement, and in doing it, ideally help you work out how to deal with it in rich countries, but also, hopefully, the framework will work with poorer countries. In essence, procurement costs big bucks, huge proportions of GDP, huge proportions of government expenditure, as you can see. In Europe alone, the European Commission estimates that about $120 billion a year, euros a year is lost to procurement. And as we've heard, there are a whole bunch of red flags. We can start to identify the red flags, looking through a whole process from the pre-bidding, the bidding, the suppliers, etc., etc., etc. Now, in trying to understand this, what I'm wanting to do is to develop a framework where we can diagnose the issues at stake. Because unless you can diagnose the issues, you can't even start to think about the interventions. And the diagnosis invariably involves breaking things down to their lowest level. Now, we've talked about red flags. As you can see, coming up on the screen are numerous reports, all of which list red flag after red flag, pages of them. OECD, United Nations, UNODC, private firms, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, various anti-corruption agencies and so on. Now, in my work, as Joel sort of outlined different types of corruption, and in my work, I've developed a framework that I've called the TASP framework. Different types of corruption, different activities, different sectors, different places. Bribery, conflict of interest, extortion, pay-to-play, they're types of corruption. Different activities. You have corruption in buying things, in hiring people, in building things, in administering things. And then you find it in different sectors, in the construction sector, in the pharmaceutical sector, in the health sector, in the whatever, and in different places. And so what I've tried to do now is to start to look at some of these types in the procurement space. Things like rigging pre-tender conditions, cartel behaviour, pay-to-play, delivering inferior products. You can start to identify these, but also to look at them in an activity context. Sometimes there are no laws or regulations. Sometimes there are weak laws. Sometimes there are good laws that are circumvented. And we heard from both of our previous speakers about that. So, looking at, understanding there are different types, as Joel clearly pointed out, bribery, collusion, capture, different activities. John pointed these out, in terms of the role of what the controller does. What I'm trying to do is look at different types, different procurement types, what I call standard, customised, intangible, complex, and incomparable. Now, I'm not going to talk about the incomparable. The incomparable is, sending a rocket to the moon, building a new fighter plane that nobody's ever built before. You can't get another quote. It's not quite the same. But if we start to, take the standard stuff, this is buying pencils and papers and laptops and vehicles. You can identify what they're worth. You can get quotes and so on. And what I've done in the slide is look at the different corruption risks that go with buying pencils and paper. Things like false invoices, favouring certain suppliers, undersupplying quantities and so on. When we move to customised stuff, this is special IT systems, the vehicles you buy that you then have to adapt as an ambulance or a police vehicle, training activities, debt collection, these are customised. Then you've got a different set of corruption risks. Unrealistic specifications that might favour one supplier, inadequate specifications that can allow different sorts of interpretations and so on. If we move to the intangible, and what we have in the intangible, these are products that can't be easily measured, and the deliverables aren't standardised, like legal services or consultancy services, or, you know, you want this lawyer because they're the very best. They might cost 3 times as much, but they might get you a better result or something like that. And so what we've seen, and I'm basing this on some empirical research that I've done, that, you know, you favour particular consultants, or sometimes you do consultancies for friends, cronies that are totally meaningless, stuff that could be done in the office anyway, inflating research and consultancy prices. So they're a different set of risks. And moving, what have we done there? We've lost something. We've lost it. The fourth area is more complex things. Sorry?
Your slide's
Oh, slide's still there? That's all right, Glenn, I know what I'm talking about. That's fine, I've just lost my screen. That's all right, I know what I'm talking about. I think I know what I'm talking about. And the complex stuff is, you know, things that require managing different professions and processes that are much more complex, you know, building the roads, looking at sort of major infrastructure projects and so on and so forth. And we've all, you know, heard where are we going back there? The road to nowhere, or the rigging of the bids, or the delayed rewards where a minister in a government can, at a much later date, join the board, but by fixing the complexity of all that is taking place. Well, as I said, I'm working on some empirical work. And we did a study in one Australian state where over the last 30 years they've had 172 hearings about corrupt activity, and about a quarter of them have been procurement related. And what we see is that 2/3 of them fell within 3 areas: in transport, in education, and in local government. And what we also found, and as we said, what we did is we did these 40-odd cases, and we tried to look at the opportunity, we look at the nature of the corrupt activity, the opportunities, who was involved, where it was initiated, what was lost, what the processes were, and how they might have been prevented. In 3/4 of our cases, the initiator was a public servant, not somebody outside. 3/4 were lone wolf situations, somebody working alone, not a conspiracy. 3/4 involved a senior person. And what we found, again, and this is rich country stuff, more than half the issue was about issuing fraudulent invoices or false receipts or dummy quotes, something to do with the funding process. About 1/3 of them involved disclosing commercially confidential information to private companies, or setting up their own companies, civil servants having their own companies, or that of their relatives. And about 10% were involved with concealing undersupply in a situation, or keeping quiet while preferred contractors overcharged the department. The losses, again, we're talking rich country stuff. About 40% were below $1 million. About 1/4 were between $1 million and $5 million. And it's interesting, about 1/3 of them involved no clear bribe. There was no cash involved. They were just steering contracts to friends, and in some cases, love played a role. People became romantically involved with people and wanted to impress their partner or their partner's family who had a business, and so on and so forth. So how do we start to deal with all of this? In trying to understand the opportunities, there are really 3 issues. For a corrupt event to occur, you need a motivated offender, you need a target, and you need the absence of a capable guardian. Take away any of those three conditions and you don't have a corrupt process. If you don't have your offender, you don't have your target, or you have a very, very good guardianship. And so we've started by trying to look at these three things, and we'll start, with the issue of guardianship. What we found was there were three overriding things. Conflict of interest was something that came about as a lack of guardianship. It wasn't always sufficiently identified. There were private companies, there were shell companies involved, and often there wasn't sufficient whistleblower protection, and we'll come back to that as well. The accountability stuff often were poor processes, but more important than poor processes, confusion and lack of organisational clarity about what the agency was meant to do, what the process was about, and very importantly, lack of leadership often resulted in a culture, an organisational culture where public accountability simply wasn't valued. And these leadership failures were apparent where there'd been previous experiences, people hadn't learned their lessons and so on. And the issue of trust. Invariably, trust was either exaggerated. We had senior people who were trusted implicitly, and junior people would look at the accounts and say, this doesn't look right, and they'd say, oh no, Joe Blow, he's the deputy secretary or something like that, and therefore it just must be right. Who am I to override the authorisation that he's made? But also, people were in senior positions where they were trusted by colleagues and subordinates, and then that gave them licence in a way to do the sorts of things they did. So looking at those three things, pulling apart the trust structure, the accountability structure, and the conflict of interest structure will give us our framework. So what we found of all our cases, and this is again, we're talking rich country stuff, we've got two sets of issues. On the one hand, there's system failure. The rules weren't there. There were insufficient rules, insufficient processes, the checks and balances didn't work. Or, on the other hand, and they fell 50-50 between these two, system weaknesses. The rules were there, but there was a failure to apply the existing rules. And often these were because of culture, because of sort of dominant ideas and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to do now is to say, okay, we'll take these cases and let's try and identify the slippage points. Where did it go wrong and how can that be used in prevention? And the slippage points essentially are, culture, due process, temptation, often willful disregard by managers or incompetence and so on. And so I've drawn up a matrix, which is blank at the moment, that we list sort of due process, we list temptation, we list managerial incompetence, and as we go through our cases, we say, okay, what were the conditions that allowed these to happen? What were the processes? How were they detected? And what can we do to prevent? And so to give you an example, and we've sort of pulled this together from a number of our cases. The due process thing, the conditions were there was an anything goes attitude. People figured, that's okay, it doesn't really matter. The process, there was no regard for conflict of interest. The detection, a complaint might have been received, or there might have been an audit. And the prevention of process, the one we're talking about is exposure and prosecution. The case that this came from was a case in our State Railways Authority where a bunch of people worked together, they colluded together, they over-invoiced, they set up companies, they bought equipment at grossly inflated prices, took it for their own companies, overcharged. There's a whole range of stuff there. And the attitude was very much an anything goes, but there was also a feeling that it had always been like this. They didn't think they'd ever be caught. And they figured if they were caught, nothing had happened to them anyway. But they were caught, they were prosecuted, and several people were imprisoned, and tens of millions of dollars was lost. When we look at temptation and easy benefits, you look at the red flags, the value of the contracts, the nature of the equipment, how the processes can be manipulated. Detection, that's the Anti-Corruption Authority for the research that we were doing. And the prevention relates to things like transparency, adherence to processes, recognising risk. And when you look at things like slippage points like managerial incompetence or willful disregard, you've got management that feel that they're above scrutiny, or management that's inbred and tired. And the processes, the impunity by which processes are violated and so on. And sometimes regular audits don't detect the things, but there are different detection processes, and the prevention comes in oversight and accountability, and also some form of a whistleblower protection. So to finish, what I really want to do is pull it all together to say that yes, every context is different. What happens in poor countries is different to what happens in rich countries, but we can start to put together some thoughts that look at different slippage points. The appropriate oversight and compliance is important. Too much is counterproductive, too little is counterproductive. And this comes in sort of trying to understand organisational culture. You can't make a rule for every situation, as people have shown, and the more rules you make, the more that people can work around the rules. And strengthening the culture of integrity comes very, very much from leadership at the top. And this is certainly in our Australian environments. We've worked with leaders of departments to make sure that these anything goes attitudes and conflicts of interest are just not part of the culture. And the risk profile has to be tailored to the situation at hand. It's very, very hard to assume that there are silver bullets for any situation. Thanks very much.
Okay, we have time for questions. Who has a question? Come on.
With respect to the debarment process for the World Bank, yeah, sure. Is it on? With respect to the debarment process of the World Bank, what kind of fact-finding or legal process is there before you make a decision to debar a firm?
Okay, so thanks. So we have a quasi-judicial approach to this. There is a group in the bank that's called the Integrity Vice Presidency that's responsible for investigating any allegations of corruption in a World Bank finance project. So what happens when there's an allegation of corruption in a World Bank finance project, there's an investigation that goes on. If there's an initial thing, and if it's determined that it's sufficiently there's a reason to go on with the investigation, then there's a full investigation, and we have a number of people who primarily were former prosecutors and forensic auditors who work in the bank, who do exclusively that work. So to the extent that there's a finding that there actually has been an act of corruption, and that there are sort of finer legal definitions, so we define fraud, and we do corruption as a catch-all, then there's a sanctioning body. Then the investigative unit will propose a sanction on a firm. That sanction can then be appealed in a sanctions board. There are a set of independent people who are on that board. The firm that's being sanctioned has the right for representation and can argue why this is actually incorrect, factually, or an inappropriate response. And then the sanctions board will make a decision. All of that is actually codified and written out. So there's a record that's produced sort of as a quasi-judicial proceeding that then gets announced, and that's how a firm is debarred. A debarment usually happens for a certain amount of time, so it's not that you're debarred for the lifetime. They're often at this point, oftentimes you get debarred, and in order to get off the debarment list, you also have to prove that you have created an effective integrity function. So that they've actually taken affirmative steps to address the corruption that's happened to prevent that from happening again. So There is actually, frankly, I don't know the website, but if you go into sort of sanctions, World Bank and Sanctions Board, I believe you would find the whole record, and you'd be able to find actually the record of cases that have happened on this.
A question for the State Controller. Have any of your pre-audit exercises or protocols produced any cases where you've actually identified procurement fraud or corruption?
How about that? There we go. Sorry. So the answer to that is yes. We find, and again, so I'm defining fraud as more broadly as fraud, waste, and abuse. Some of that has resulted in criminal fraud. So we had a construction case, for example, where a contract was issued to a firm that was a shell company. One of Joel's examples turned out to be associated with organized crime. So that case actually was prosecuted by the Attorney General's office. We reject a lot of contracts where we find collusion. Again, some of this in the construction space, a lot of it in the services space, where it's clear that a agency wrote specifications in a request for proposal that steered that contract to a particular firm. And when we review that, we say that's under the state statutes, there is a presumption that those kind of bids are going to be competitive. And we rejected numerous contracts because the requirements clearly steered that contract to a particular firm. We also reject a number of contracts based upon not obtaining a fair price. And a lot of times we go out and research, right, what a comparable commodity in particular is priced at, either with another state agency or in the marketplace itself. Sometimes we go back to the agency and say, go back to the contractor and negotiate and get a better price. So we don't necessarily reject the contract in that situation, but we save the state some money. In other cases, we reject it and say, start over. Most of that information is captured in an annual report that we do, both to talk about the performance of the agency, but we also have other statutory reports, what's called a Procurement Stewardship Act report that we publish annually.
Just one follow-up. Have any of those cases actually, can you trace them back to the kind of data analytics that you were referring to, where you have to look at a very large sort of universe of transactions and come up with criteria to identify suspicious ones?
Yeah. So we got some legislation passed 2 years ago, Article 8A, which formally kind of recognized the need for the Controller's Office to coordinate fraud, waste, and abuse activities across all of our state agencies. I hired a couple of folks who were not auditors, who are really statisticians and have stood up a small data analytics office for us, because we get, mountains of data and can't take, the statutorily required 90 days maximum to review all those contracts. We've started with that group really focusing on the payment side of things first. So we started with credit card data. We started with payment data. Those lend itself to analytical techniques pretty quickly, because we do have a statewide platform, the statewide financial system, where we gather all that information from. So we're now, we just actually put out the report last month on that. It's required September 1st every year. But we've identified a number of, again, a lot of it waste, I would say, where a double invoice came in, right? And we identified that, went back and got the money from the vendor. Or we saw an employee making purchases on a credit card instead of buying it off of state contract, so they're paying retail when they should pay wholesale. A lot of those kind of things. We've also identified some real contract administration problems with the state, which is a perennial issue, frankly, for our state agencies. So we had a major contract with SUNY Downstate Medical Center where they brought in a consultant and basically were not reviewing the invoices that that consultant was billing. And these guys were staying at the Carlisle Hotel and running up $1,000 bills for meals and stuff like that. And again, we've gone back and recaptured all that kind of money.
Question for the gentleman at the World Bank and at the controller. Talking about low bid contracts and alternatives to low bid contracts, intuitively we go out and we buy Starbucks coffee instead of from the coffee vendor down the street because we know that one's better even though it costs more. What metrics can be put in place on a government level for contracts that aren't low bid contracts so that you achieve both quality and price?
Can we do that first? Sure. So the state for quite some time now has had the ability to do best value contracts. And we do that across technology, services, even certain commodities where the law permits it. The challenge with getting that right is to basically get the requirements in the request for proposal that goes out to bidders correctly, that clearly defines what is value in this as the state defines it. That could be not only just the price of that service, but the things around that, right? So the support, the maintenance, the warranty, all of those kind of things have to be defined in a way that they can be scored or evaluated. And so they're tying those requirements to an evaluation instrument that correctly can kind of compare bids is really the key to getting quality, best value contracts. We see some good ones and we see some horrible ones, truthfully. Some of that is because our agencies lack expertise in that area. They may not do a lot of these kind of contracts, on a regular basis. They may, have, like a lot of folks who are walking out the door lost their kind of go-to institutional person who really understood how to craft that kind of RFP, because it is as much an art as a science, truly, to get those things right. But we also see, as I mentioned, where people intentionally, right, craft them in a way that is steering it towards an incumbent vendor or a certain kind of preferred vendor. But when we look at those contracts, we're looking primarily at how are the requirements defined and does it really match how that contract was evaluated and ultimately awarded.
So for us, we have a slightly different problem. So oftentimes when you look at procurement systems, what you see is 90 to 95% of the actual contracts are tiny contracts. Because each individual, through the sort of approach of a decentralized approach to procurement, you have everyone buying their own tiny little things. So I was just in a country where basically 90% of the volume of contracts were for contracts of under $2,000, where the processing of the contract probably costs more than the contract itself. And that you see very often, actually. And so obviously the way to move a little bit is towards greater centralized purchasing or e-marketplaces or something that prevents everyone from going to the market individually. Now that then creates this whole set of problems of, like, for computers, how do you actually define a standard computer that's going to be useful for the whole variety of things that the government needs computers for? How do you build in variation? And then how do you deal with actually finding a cost that is actually an appropriate cost? That's the nature of the issues for us oftentimes, is that sense of how do you centralize so that you prevent this incredible churning of very tiny purchases in ways that allow you to standardize, but don't create a standardization that is so severe that the places that really do need better quality computers are able to buy those computers in a more efficient fashion. So I believe the question, I think John's answer is technically I have nothing to add. Our issue is a little bit different. And there isn't actually a particular metric in doing that. I think it is kind of depending upon the type of good we're talking about and trying to work through how you have more e-marketplaces that allow you for some of that variation.
You put up on the screen all these different guides and how much information is out there about identifying red flags on procurement and the like, and it's overwhelming the amount of kind of suggestions that are out there for procurement fraud. But is there any particular publication or guide that you find to be maybe the most useful if folks are looking to maybe download one of these and take a look at them, because the number of them can be so overwhelming?
The shorter guides are better than the longer guides. And not wanting to be parochial, one of our anti-corruption authorities in Australia put out a 3-page guide, and it says much of what many of the longer guides say. But again, these are very much like recipe books. And not everybody has all the same ingredients. Not everybody has, the same context. So the really important thing really is the last point on that last slide up there, and that is to tailor to specific cases. So what I'm trying to do and what these are trying to do is to give some general principles and some sort of framework that you can then adapt.
Can I add just one thing? Because so one of the problems with red flags is then you actually try to find in the empirical basis for the red flag. So if you have the red flag and then you dig into the contract to see, is there a greater proportion of corruption in contracts identified with red flags or not? So I know for our red flags, there's nothing. When we actually look at there's not a greater probability that there's corruption in contracts that have red flags than contracts that don't have red flags. So the empirical basis, so while they actually are associated with things we believe are identifiers of risk, when you actually look at the underlying contract, it's really weak, that evidence. Now, maybe it's our problems, and we don't actually very rigorously do this. So other people who process a lot more contracts may have much stronger empirical evidence, but we have the sort of the conceptualization of risk and the actual reality of corruption, and those things aren't necessarily the same. But
yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the challenge for entities like us, right, who are charged with reviewing these kind of things and catching potential fraud, waste, and abuse is they don't manifest themselves necessarily at the same point every time, right? You have to look at the entire procure-to-pay process to really start to look at what are, potential red flags, right? You can have a good contract, but if that contract is poorly administered, or if there is collusion between the agency and the entity providing the goods or service, the state can still be overcharged, double billed, et cetera, right? You can have bad contracts up front. I mentioned a few examples that we rejected. Again, may have been for a very important public purpose, but they were poorly done. They were just executed badly, and we have to, unfortunately have to send people back to the beginning and start over. So it really is a challenge in the public procurement space to kind of, follow that money all the way through to identify, where are the problems manifesting themselves.
Great. Well, we've gone a little over, so let's try to just take about a 7 or 8 minute break. We'll start back promptly at 10:30, and please join me in thanking our first panel.
I'll get your card. I'm interested in your slide deck.
Thanks, Joe. The empirical
More of a conversation between these two fine folks. So I'll introduce them now. To my far left, Liz Duncan-Gilmore is the Executive Director and Counsel for the Minority Business Development Institute, which helps train CEOs to build their businesses and break through race and gender barriers in government procurement. Liz also has worked in the insurance industry and in financial services, and she's going to kind of tell us about the interest in vendors and why the system, the procurement system, may be challenging for them to navigate and maybe how it can be better. And then to my immediate left, Daryl Williams is the Agency Chief Contracting Officer for New York City's Small Business Services. His responsibilities include oversight of all agency procurements, acting as a liaison to city oversight agencies, and ensuring compliance with all relevant rules and laws and regulations and the like. Daryl has worked in city government procurement for more than 25 years, including contract management and administration and procurement oversight. So he is our view of the procurement officer side. He's going to tell us about the system and how it works, and then he and Liz will have a discussion about these issues and these tensions maybe, and then we'll have some questions for them. So perhaps we start with Daryl giving us kind of a description and oversight of city procurement, and then we'll go from there.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So I just want to start by giving you an idea of how the city procurement process works. As you heard previously from the other speakers, there are enormous challenges when you're working in procurement, specifically when it comes to protecting the spending of taxpayer dollars. I'm sure everyone here wants government to spend responsibly and to not overspend. But our process is dictated by a set of rules that are promulgated by various political politicians within the city of New York, headed by the mayor. It's called the Procurement Policy Board rules. Those are the rules by which all city agencies must comply when they're conducting procurements. It specifies based on dollar amount the methods that have to be used to procure goods and services. You've heard some of them already: bids, RFPs, which are requests for proposals. There's some unique ones called negotiated acquisition. That's where you use a smaller pool of vendors to select. But so that is what we utilize. All of the agency chief contracting officers are responsible for adhering to those. And one unique thing about agency chief contracting officers, they not only report to the agency commissioner, but they also report to the city's chief procurement officer. That is the person that heads procurement for the entire city. So I basically serve two masters, the commissioner of the agency and also the city's chief procurement officer. There's a lot in terms of procurement, but we have methods by which we can utilize to procure goods. There are protections that are built in. The rules pretty much go into everything in terms of cost, in terms of integrity, in terms of background, everything that we must do to ensure that the city is getting the best value and the best vendor. Very often that sort of collides with some of the things that the city wants to put in place. So some of the things that Liz is going to talk about in terms of dealing with minority and women-owned businesses and small businesses that are trying to grow. Some of the things that we have in place can at times appear to be a deterrent to them being involved in the city's process. But as a government servant, my job is to try to level the playing field. So I'll let Liz talk a little bit about what their challenges are, and I think this is a good place for us to really have a dialogue back and forth, because I think a lot of what we do as the city will come out as a result of the challenges that she presents.
Thank you, Daryl. So yeah, we're in a unique position in that we contract with, and I've worked with Daryl at New York City Small Business Services, and we've got Abigail from Small Business Services up there. We're in contract with them right now. We contract with New York State. And we're also in contract with the World Bank's finance arm, the IFC. So we've worked in each of the arenas, really, that we've discussed today. So it was really interesting to hear the first panel and some of the perspectives of what's going on around the world and around the state, around procurement, and also with Daryl's perspective When we were talking, preparing for this discussion we're having, he was telling me even more about what are some of the things that take it so long to get to contract. So one of the primary things I find as a vendor myself, and also working with small business vendors, we do consulting in the construction space. So our clients are typically minority, women, veteran, Native American-owned construction companies. And what they're trying to do is break through from working in the private sector alone to get a piece of the public construction that's going on all over, which is considered to be, did this just go off? Which is considered to be fairly lucrative when managed properly. So one of the big things that happens when you go from that transition is when you're working on a private contract, you can be paid on a current basis or even ask for a percentage up front to fund your work. When you're transitioning over into the public space, not only do these RFPs, these requests for proposals, take many, many hours to respond to, and that costs thousands of dollars to small businesses. It often can be many months before you're paid a penny for your work. And if you don't win, you don't get anything back. So let's say it costs you as a small business $6,000 to prepare a response to an RFP, which is not only even if you do the same type of work again and again, each of the agencies and each of the RFPs is set up a different way. You can't just have a boilerplate that you create and then that you use again and again. You're always having to recreate. And even if there's a certain amount of cutting and pasting, it's still a pretty laborious process. And then to what Daryl does, the additional information that you have to pull together to make sure that you're presenting that your business is legitimate. In the MWBE space, the Minority Women Business Business Enterprise space, you have to show that you're certified, which is a whole other process. There's a lot of paperwork that you have to make sure you have current and ready to attach to all your RFPs. So then, let's say next you get awarded a contract. So I'm going to use an example with a contract that we're doing with New York City Small Business Services right now. The RFP, I believe, was due sometime in January. We were awarded the contract in March, I think on March 17th or something like that, and we're about to sign the contract, the actual contract, next week. So it's a 7-month lag between the time we were actually awarded the contract and we're actually going to business. Now there are a lot of twists and turns along the way, but once you're actually awarded a contract, it doesn't mean that you can just sign, because then you have to get to terms. Because there's the RFP and then there's how you responded to it, and you have to make the two fit. And sometimes it's taking a square peg and cramming it into a round hole. And then it has to go through all the steps that I'd like to pass it back to Daryl to say, what has happened? Why have we waited so long? Why does it take the Mayor's Office of Contract Services so long to register a contract?
Yeah, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of what happens in any government procurement process. Once we've issued a bid or an RFP and we've determined who the winner is, that's when all of the things that the government needs to do to protect itself, to ensure that we're getting the best price, that's when the analysis of that comes into play. It's not just looking at the services that we're getting, because we pretty much know what it is we're looking for. That's what was the basis for selection. The issue of whether someone is qualified, that's been something that's been determined already because we've already selected them. But once you select a vendor, then you have to sort of take a microscopic look at who they are. The city's rules require us to look at the background of every vendor, to look at their business integrity, to look at their ethical principles. We have laws that we have to comply with. Every vendor has to comply with EEO regulations, city, state, and federal. So we gather information from them regarding that. We also do a background check of not just the business itself, but the principles involved in that business. So we look at the business, we do background checks, we look at Dun & Bradstreet, we go through LexisNexis. We need to know who we're doing business with. I usually often describe that as the same situation where if you're a business owner and you're hiring an employee, you don't just hire someone who walks in off the street who says, I can do this. You want to know references. You want to know how long they've been doing this. You want to know whether if it's someone who's handling cash, you want to know if they've been bonded before. So these are all the things that we look at, because everyone has to understand that we're talking about government dollars. It's not private sector money. There's you know, the public is our responsibility is to the public, and we have a large responsibility because whenever people hear that government funds have been sort of tossed away or we didn't look at the background of vendors, it's a loss for all of us. All of us pay into that. But the process that we go through once a vendor is selection is to look at all of those things. Their business integrity. Sometimes we'll ask for them to submit copies of their most recent audit reports. So we want to determine whether the vendor is capable of performing financially as well. I'm sure you've probably heard government doesn't always pay timely, although the city does have a 30-day prompt payment provision that goes in all of its contracts. Once we receive what we call a valid invoice, we have 30 days within which to pay. But there's a lot that goes into on the front end. Once a vendor is selected, we collect background information. That information is collected directly from the vendor. It's reviewed. Then after that's done, then we have our New York City Department of Investigation do a background check so that before I sign off on an award to them, I know exactly what it is, who it is we're dealing with, and what they've done, what their background is. Now, sometimes we do get information that comes back that will make us think about whether we really want to do business with vendors, because we also do tax checks. You know, we don't want to award contracts to a vendor who owes taxes to the city. I'm sure that if that was publicized, a lot of you would say we didn't know what we were doing. So we need to make sure that all of these things are in order. We do property checks, income tax checks on the principals, so that once we do these checks, any information that we need to know is put into a memo from the Department of Investigation, and that is one of the things that takes a lot of time. Once we've gathered that information and it's been passed along to them, it can take up to 30 days or more before they generate that memo. One of the reasons why it takes so long is that for every contract over $100,000, we are required to do that background check. And we have a lot of contracts that are in excess of $100,000. And so we need to generate memos for all of those contractors that are getting contracts over $100,000. So we're talking about looking at background, business integrity, we're looking at their financial ability, their ability to maintain and perform on a contract. We're looking at EEO regulations that they have to comply with. There are all of these things that we have to look at, and certainly that does take a long time to do. Those responsibilities are given to different agencies. So the Department of Investigation, they conduct the investigation. Unfortunately, I don't have any control over how long that takes. Also, when it comes to taxes, the Department of Finance, that information is generated by them, and they then return it to us so that we can make a decision. But ultimately, once all of this information in, the final decision in determining whether we should, in fact, award to that vendor is really mine. I'm making the response, that decision, that's my responsibility on behalf of the agency. So I have to certainly make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed.
Can I ask a question, Daryl? When you say you gather all these different kinds of information before it goes over to DOI for the check that they do and DOF for the check that they do, does that mean that each individual agency that the procurement is going to go through does that check? So whoever's going to be administering the contract, that's the agency that pulls together that information?
Yes, all of that, the agency pulls that information together, and the information that we get regarding the background, that we gather that information, but it's then given over to the Department of Investigation, because it's their responsibility based on the information contained in documentation to determine whether any of the information is true or not. It asks questions about, past litigation involving the business, any litigation regarding the principals. So the information is gathered by the agency. Some of it is information that we would look at. For instance, if we were looking at whether a vendor was solvent or not, whether we thought that they had the financial capacity to maintain a contract, I would then sit down and talk with my budget director and people in audit to make that determination. They would help me make that determination.
And are there any timelines that are on that process? So are there any regulations that say this whole process should take no more than 60 days or 90 days? I mean, is there anything like that?
I think because one of the things is because of the high volume of contracts that we award and the number of vendors that we utilize, that the Department of Investigation is not sort of given a timeline within which they have to provide that memo, and of course that elongates the process. And very often a lot of the oversight agencies, the Mayor's Office of Contracts, the Office of Management and Budget, and these are all agencies that I have to get approval from even after we've selected a vendor. So let me just quickly go through vendor selection. Once we select, we go through the background information, we gather that information. The selection of that vendor then has to go to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget reviews it to make sure that that vendor, that the money, the budget that we're utilizing for it is an appropriate budget and that we've gotten the best possible deal that we can get. But their primary responsibility is to make sure that that contract is within the budget that we have for that particular service. Once they determine and they agree with that, then it moves on to the Mayor's Office of Contracts. Now, the Mayor's Office of Contracts, their responsibility is to review and look at the procurement process that we've conducted. So they'll look to determine whether it was advertised. We have advertisement requirements, whether it was advertised, whether we use the appropriate bidders list. And those things like that. They'll look at the criteria that we utilize for selection, whether it was a bid or an RFP. They will look at that and determine whether selection was made based on that. When we do an RFP, there are evaluators who evaluate all the proposals that come in. So the Mayor's Office of Contracts will ask for copies of those scoring sheets for them to determine and make sure that there was consistency amongst the evaluators in terms of selection. And so once that's done, they will then, and if that contract is in excess of $100,000, here's another part of sort of government bureaucracy, that contract also has to go to a public hearing. Because these are public dollars, any contracts in excess of $100,000 are required to go to a public hearing. The purpose of that is to give the public an opportunity to speak for or against the contract. Very often, it depends on the type of contract that gets that sort of response. Very often, years ago, I worked for the Department of Homeless Services, and at that time, we were citing quite a number of shelters around the city, and we always had a lot of opposition because no community necessarily wants homeless shelters in their community. And so those contracts, the fact that those contracts go to a public hearing, it gives the public an opportunity, and also public officials. A lot of public officials, specifically when a contract affects their particular community, they will come out and speak for or against it, depending on what their community feels about it. In addition to which, sometimes there are differences of opinion in terms of public notice. Was the public notified if this was something that was being done? Were they given an opportunity to have input? Did you go to the community board and make the community board aware of what you were doing? And if you did, was it full disclosure? So the public hearing, the purpose of the public hearing is to give the public and anyone and any of the politicians an opportunity to speak for or against the contract. Once the public hearing is conducted, then we finalize the award, and it's sent to the Mayor's Office's contract for final approval. Once we receive that final approval, then it has to go to the Office of the City Comptroller for registration. The Comptroller does, in fact, have 30 days within which to register a contract. So it's a very long process. It's very involved. There are lots of bits and pieces involved. Most of the rules that, if you take a look at the PPP rules, there's a public purpose for having the rules in terms of just guarding against fraud and corruption and making sure that people are following one process. Everyone follows the same process.
Right, so as you can hear, all these things make for a lot of frustration among particularly small vendors. And a lot of it is centered around the financial piece. You've got staff that you have to staff up and say that you're going to have these people on staff to manage this contract, and you've got to pay those people. And again, it often takes many months before you're paid. And I have experienced that once you are under contract, New York City Small Business Services is pretty good to pay. They do honor that 30 days or better payment piece. But again, especially for when we're working with small construction contractors, I want to give just a tiny little background about women and minority businesses in public procurement. There are goals. There have been disparity studies done around the country in New York City and in New York State that have found that the government entities are procuring an inordinate amount of funding and contracts to white male-owned businesses. They do a study of the community and find out who is ready, willing, and able to contract with the entities who performs this task, and then find out, are they actually getting a piece of it? Overwhelmingly, they have found absolutely not. They are not, and there are specific numbers that are brought around and goals set on public contracts. The goal of the goals is to show that the city, the state, whatever it is contracting away with people what the community resembles, so everybody gets a share. The problem we find is a lot of the small minority women-owned businesses don't have the financial wherewithal or don't have the they can't pay to play, and they don't have an attorney or a lobbyist on staff to help them get to contract. So one of the things we do is we run education programs, and we do consulting with these businesses to help them build the infrastructure they need so that they can manage this. I'm an attorney, I work for a small business, and it's still very daunting for me to deal with the contracting process. When I look at the contract for New York City, the standard boilerplate contract, it's 125 pages. There are so many requirements, and this is just the boilerplate. This isn't going into the scope of services, the addendums, the exhibits that you have to know. And if you don't look at it, a lot of times, especially small businesses, they're like, oh, this is my big shot. You know, I hear from a lot of small, I would say 3 to 4 small contracting firms a year come to me and say, I've just been given this great opportunity to work on a $3 million contract with XYZ prime contractor. And I say to them, okay, that's wonderful. What's the largest contract you've ever done before? And they say $100,000. And so then I have to go through the whole battery of things that you need to show if you're going to successfully work on this $3 million contract. Do you have 10 to 15% of cash on hand or capital available to finance this project until you get paid? Do you understand what you're going to be doing in terms of bidding? And overwhelmingly, the answer is no. Can they qualify for bonding? No. And we have to say, you know, this contract could be the last one you ever do, because once you fail on a public contract, whether you're working directly with the agency or whether you're working for a prime contractor, often that's the last contract you'll ever do. You become financially bankrupt, you get a bad reputation, and then they look for the next business to move forward. So even though there are these goals of, you know, in New York City, they're quite high, anywhere from 9 to 30% goals on contracts that minorities and women have to participate. Finding the people who are ready to go is very difficult. And even if they are ready to go, people change habits it's hard to get people to change. So the prime contractors have the subs they've been working with for years, and they just want to keep using them. So whether they're racially motivated or not, a lot of people don't want to move. You know, the works are stuck. So that's part of what we do, is we try to say, hey, you've got no reason to say you can't find anybody, because we have a list here. If you call us, we can introduce you to some people who might work. So again, a lot of push me, pull me, and a lot of issues that the vendors have to try to overcome to get to the table, and get to the point where you wait, you know, months before you get to contract.
Let me just add that now this is where Liz and SBS comes together, because her agency has a contract with SBS to do bonding. Had a contract to do bonding readiness for us. So they work with minority and women-owned businesses who are a lot of them in the construction business, to get them ready and prepared to actually get a bond so that they can compete for those larger contracts. Much of what SBS does is not just businesses, small businesses, but we have focused programs for minority and women-owned businesses, which is we are the home of the certification program for city certification. And so we certify any business that qualifies to be certified by the city. In addition to that, we also put on the fast track people who want to be state certified. But we have a lot of programs for minority and women-owned businesses. We have selling to government, which I speak at every month, where newly certified firms come in and we talk to them about what it is they need to do business with the city. And I give them a lot of sort of inside information that they probably would not otherwise get, to give them a head start and to have them understand what they need to do to be ready to do business with the city. But a lot of our what we call capacity building programs are programs that work specifically with minority-owned businesses in construction and general goods and services. We have different types of programs for businesses that provide different types of goods and services. So one of the things that we try to do through those programs is to get them to understand what the city requirements are and to help them with that. So we now have programs where we have a capital loan program. So vendors who are awarded a contract, a contract with the city, they can come to Small Business Services and apply for a capital loan to help them with that money that they need to get started on a project. We also have a construction mentorship program where minority and women-owned construction businesses are paired or up with prime contractors, and they're utilized as subcontracts on some of the major city contracts that we have. Now that program is significant because they're paired up with a vendor who has a lot of experience in construction, and they can help them through the pitfalls that they could come across during the course of a contract in terms of making sure that they're complying with OSHA requirements, anything from infrastructure issues that they may have to just being on the job and making sure that they have the skills necessary to perform their particular portion of the contract. So we have a number of programs where we team up with minority and women-owned businesses to help get them ready to perform on contracts and also to deal with some of their particular issues, because a lot of the smaller businesses, as Liz said, they have infrastructure problems. Some of them, they are not big enough to afford an auditor. They don't make enough money to have an audit done every 3 years. So, and these are some of the things as an agency chief contracting officer that when we put requirements into bids and RFPs, and there's a vendor who wants to apply and they're qualified and they may not have an audit that was done in the next 3 years, I do have the discretion to allow them to submit something instead of that. So I could ask them for income and balance sheets. I could ask them for copies of their tax returns. And I do that because I want there to be competition. My job is not just to oversee the process, to make sure that it's fair. We encourage competition regardless of where it comes from, so long as all the vendors are upstanding and they can actually do the job. So my job is twofold. Is to make sure that I'm adhering to the rules that we're required to adhere to, but also to try to promote some of these smaller businesses that are out here trying to compete. It's very difficult for smaller businesses specifically to compete in New York. Just really on a national and international level, you have major companies, IBM and all of these Apple and all of these companies that are international. So when we decide that we want to buy computers, and one other thing, let me just also mention that the city is interested because we're government. We do contracts for volume purchasing. So which means that every city agency, they need computers. So instead of each individual agency doing its own procurement, we have the Division of Citywide Administrative Services, and they administer and put out contracts on behalf of the entire city. So, for instance, everybody has to buy computers, so they'll do one large procurement for computers. If we need vehicles, there'll be one contract to buy vehicles for the entire city, which all the agencies can utilize. It's efficient because you only have one agency that's doing the procurement. You're not using an administrative staff in every single division to administer 20 different contracts for the very same thing. And you have the advantage of getting volume pricing when you're issuing contracts like that. So just in terms of getting into fraud, I want to get back to that issue. A lot of what the agency does is upfront to make sure that we have a vendor who has business integrity and they have a good financial background. But a lot of it also has to do with when you're negotiating contracts. What are the terms that you have in the contracts? Now, the city does have its boilerplate provisions, but those provisions are not always applicable or easy to apply to every contract. So sometimes when we're negotiating contracts and we want to make sure that, especially when you're receiving services and they're getting paid for those services, I'll give you an example. Small Business Services has what we call workforce contracts, where we work with individuals who are unemployed, and we train them and we put them in and we place them in jobs. Now, for every job that vendor places someone into, they get a payment. Okay, so they get paid for every placement that they make, in addition to their operational costs. Now, the problem with that is, how do you verify the placements, right? You can't necessarily have vendors who self-report, because how do you know that the numbers that they're reporting are accurate? So what we do is we make sure, and because we've had some issues in the past with this, what we do is when the vendor reports those things, they tell us where they placed, we then verify the placement. So wherever they place that particular employee or client, we call and we verify that that person is actually working where they were placed. We verify the amount of money that they're making, and we do all of those things. In the past, there were contracts where we had a separate contract to verify the placements for that, but the problem with that was, and when I first went to the agency, it was one of the things I picked out right away, is they only did a 10% sampling. They only sampled 10% of everybody that was placed. And they were getting the information from the vendor that was placing them. So do you really think that they're going to give you information on ones that they're falsely placed? So when we realized that, we finally decided that the agency itself had to independently verify. So that's one of the things that we put into place. Contract management is enormous. Reviewing invoices, making sure that you're comparing the budget to the actual services provided, and that they're paying and at the rate that they're supposed to. We have things such as prevailing wage rate, which every year is issued by the New York City Comptroller for specific categories and trades, and every contractor must pay prevailing wage rate. Now, on the front end, when vendors submit their pricing, one of the things the agency is responsible for is ensuring that they're paying prevailing wage rate. How you determine that, it depends on how you structure the actual procurement. If you have a vendor who you're asking them to submit flat rate pricing, how would you know what they're paying their employees per hour? So the proper way to do that would be to have the vendor put down what they're paying their wages to their employees, how many employees they're using, then their OTPS costs, is what other than personal services costs, and if you know how many people they're going to use and what they're paying, then you can determine whether they're paying prevailing wage rate based on the number of hours their workers are going to be working each week. So there are various things that you can put into place to help you detect those things, and very often, a lot of times, we find out things after the contract is in place, and we've sort of started to audit, and we do desk audits all during the term of the contract, and we do full audits of the agency every year.
So we actually are now running over, so could you guys stay 5 more minutes at least so we can, I want to leave time for questions and also maybe comments. I know we have a number of people here from or formerly from DOI. I don't know if they want to weigh in. If John is still here from the state, he might have a kind of contrasting view of how their system works. So let's get some comments, feedback from the audience. We have about 5 minutes left. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to pretend we're going to end at 11:10. Anybody?
I have a question. You mentioned that you certify small businesses and you also fast track them for state contracts. Are you finding a lot of fraud in that process, or once a company or a vendor gets certified, things change, they're not reporting it? And who does
Well, the certification is there are qualifications for certification that the city does. The city and the state certification requirements are slightly different. So because you're certified by one doesn't mean you're automatically certified by the other. So in the city, we can certify someone according to the city certification guidelines, and then we have a connection to the state where we can put them on the fast track where because there are certain things that get reviewed to determine your certification. And so some of those common things, if we've already reviewed them, the state does not necessarily have to review them because that's already been done. But certification really just puts them in a category, a special category, where they can qualify for certain types of programs and be given some sort of, we never use the word preference, but we have programs that focuses on allowing them and helping to compete in the public sector.
And those qualifications do have to be updated pretty regularly. The certification, once certified, it doesn't go on forever.
Certification, I think now is 3 years. And as a matter of fact, some of the regulations for certification have actually increased, because even in certification, we found that there was fraud. Very often, you would have someone who was maybe a minority who was listed as a figurehead, but when you look at the actual operation of the company, there were no other minorities. This person had very little to do with it. It was just a person that was there on paper for the purpose of getting certification. So even the certification requirements had to be sort of tightened up. And so now when we do certification, we actually go to the business. In the past years, they never went to the business. They just did the certification or granted certification based on the information submitted. But now we actually go to the business place to make sure that they are actually a small business, and that it is actually, we get their business records, their corporate records to determine who owns it. And so those are all things that we had to tighten up, because even certification had some corruption built into that whole process.
And I just want to add one quick thing. In the process of interviewing people to be in programs that we run for New York City, New York State, what have you, women-owned businesses as well. One interview I had, the husband came to the interview and was clearly running the business. He had all the answers, knew everything. And then I said, your wife is the owner and the CEO of this business. Why is she not here at the interview? And he said, well, somebody's got to meet the school bus. So it was clear that they were trying to take advantage of the WBE, Women Business Enterprise certification, to get access to contracts and play on these goals, but she wasn't running the business. So just as sometimes people will put a minority figurehead up, sometimes the woman is put up as a figurehead as well. And that creates a lot of tension, because I found, working in this arena for a number of years now, that sometimes the presumption is that the woman doesn't run the business, which has all sorts of layers of, entrenched sexism and whatnot built in. So if you walk into every woman-owned business with the presumption that she doesn't run the business and look for her husband and what he's doing, that's another tension that we're working to overcome.
There are also instances sometimes where you will have a business that all of a sudden it disappears. But they reappear under a different name, a different tax ID number. But when you look behind what we call the veil, you see that there's the same individuals that are running it. So a lot of times there are businesses who may get themselves into trouble, and so they basically dissolve that business, and they sort of reappear with a different name and a different tax ID number. But that's where, as a person who's responsible for ensuring that we look at the background of vendors, that's my job, to make sure that gets done. And when I need help, it's usually the Department of Investigation that helps with it.
Well, I feel like this discussion could have taken the whole 2 hours, so I'm sorry that it's been only 40 minutes for this. I think maybe we should do some follow-up event or something. It's really interesting, and I feel like we have a lot more to talk about. But we are out of time, so please join me in thanking Liz and Daryl.
Thank you, everyone.